The silence was the first sign of a system failure. In the world of Manchik, the formidable Korean Mafia boss who ruled his empire with the chilling precision of a watchmaker, silence was a requirement. In his mansion, it was the sound of absolute obedience. It meant every guard was at his post, every camera was sweeping its arc, and every subordinate knew their place. To Manchik, a break in that silence didn't just mean a noise, it meant a breach. Tonight, the breach came from the garage. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, wholly out of place among the scent of expensive leather and the gleaming, metallic husks of his luxury fleet. It wasn't the heavy tread of an intruder or the metallic snap of a magazine being seated into a rifle. It was lighter. More fragile. Manchik sat in his office, a stark cathedral of black marble and smoked glass that felt more like a command center than a home. His mind, a cold and efficient calculator of threats, immediately began to categorize the anomaly. Was it a tracker being placed? A disgruntled driver seeking a petty revenge? An assassin waiting in the shadows of his armored sedans? Any other night, the response would have been a single, barked order that would end in a shallow grave. His hand hovered over the intercom, his fingers inches from the button that would summon a dozen armed men. But he paused. There was a vulnerability in the sound that defied his calculations. It lacked the arrogance of a professional. He rose, his tall frame clad in a fitted black dress shirt and tailored trousers, a uniform of undisputed authority. He moved through the echoing hallways of his fortress without a sound, a predator reclaiming his domain. Every polished surface he passed reflected a man whose face was a mask of disciplined neutrality, a face that had ordered the fall of rival families without a flicker of hesitation. He was a man who dealt in outcomes, not emotions. He reached the garage, the heavy door sliding open with a hiss. His eyes scanned the rows of pristine vehicles until they landed on the irregularity. There, curled in a fetal position on the cold concrete floor, lay Zuri. The contrast was jarring. She was a splash of light blue cotton against the dark, oily sheen of the floor. Her head rested on a small, battered bag, her face, usually a blur of movement in his peripheral vision, was now stilled by an exhaustion so profound it looked like a trance. Beside the millions of dollars of engineering she lay, a broken component in his perfect machine. Manchik froze mid-step, his strong posture wavering for the first time in years. This wasn't a threat to his life, it was a threat to his worldview. He stood over her, the king of the castle, looking down at the invisible struggle he had failed to see, caught in the grip of a moral decision that would change the architecture of his soul. Profit, power, and the elimination of threats. That was the code he lived by. But as he looked at the thin blanket separating the woman from the cold stone, a different word began to echo in the silence. Gajak. Family. To Manchik, the inhabitants of his mansion were rarely people, they were functions. The chef was the source of his nutrition, the security detail was the perimeter of his safety, and the housekeepers were merely the silent hands that ensured his environment remained as sterile as a surgical suite. Zuri had existed in this world as a phantom, a blur of light blue fabric seen in the reflection of a hallway mirror or a rhythmic movement in the corner of his eye as he reviewed ledgers. She was the invisible component of his comfort. She was the reason his espresso appeared at precisely 6 a.m., the reason his silk shirts were pressed with razor-edged precision, and the reason the dust of the chaotic city outside never settled on his mahogany surfaces. For 6 months, she had performed these miracles without ever once demanding his gaze. Manchik preferred it that way. Efficiency, he often thought, was a quiet machine. A component that made noise was a component that was failing. Yet, as he stood over her in the dim light of the garage, the invisible had become unavoidably, painfully visible. He watched the shallow rise and fall of her shoulders. In the harsh, clinical light of the garage, he noticed details that his brain had previously filtered out as irrelevant data. Her shoes were worn at the heels, the soles thin enough to feel every pebble of the driveway. The small bag she used as a pillow was frayed at the seams, bulging with what he realized were her only possessions. This was the woman who maintained the grandeur of a multi-million-dollar estate, yet she was sleeping on a thin blanket spread over oil-stained concrete. The contrast was a physical weight in the air. To her left sat his custom-armored sedan, a vehicle whose tires alone cost more than a year of her salary. To her right sat the woman herself, reduced to a fetal ball of exhaustion. Manchik felt a strange, cold friction in his chest. His world was built on a hierarchy of value, and for the first time, the math didn't add up. He had calculated the cost of every bullet, every bribe, and every brick in his empire, but he had never calculated the cost of the human silence he demanded. He had looked at Zuri 1,000 times and seen nothing but a polished floor. Now, looking at her in the stillness of the garage, he realized that his perfect machine was running on the fuel of a woman's quiet desperation. The component wasn't failing, it was being crushed. Menchik did not wake her. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his tall frame casting a long, dark shadow over her sleeping form, a predator who had finally stopped to look at the life he was consuming. A heavy silence hung over the garage, broken only by the low hum of the mansion's climate control. Menchik stood motionless, his presence a towering shadow over the sleeping woman. He was a man who lived by the rule of the clean strike, the belief that problems should be eliminated before they could fester. But as he looked at the thin, light blue fabric of Zuri's uniform stretched over her shivering frame, his usual decisiveness failed him. He intentionally let his leather shoe scuff against the concrete. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the stillness. Zuri bolted upright with a gasp that was less a breath and more a wounded cry. Her eyes, clouded with the fog of deep exhaustion, darted wildly before locking onto the tall, dark silhouette standing over her. Terror, raw and primal, flooded her features. She scrambled backward, her heels catching on the thin blanket, her hands scraping against the rough floor as she tried to distance herself from the master of the house. "Mr. Menchik," she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper. I'm sorry. Please. I didn't. I'll go right now." She reached frantically for her small bag, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely grip the strap. She didn't ask for mercy, she expected the same cold expulsion he gave to any failing component of his empire. "Why?" Menchik's voice was low, devoid of its usual sharp edge, yet it carried the weight of a command. He didn't move toward her, but his gaze pinned her to the spot. "Why is my housekeeper sleeping among my cars like a common thief?" Zuri froze, her head bowed, her breath coming in jagged, hitching sobs. The shame was a visible weight, pulling her shoulders down. "I have nowhere else," she whispered, the words spilling out as if a dam had finally broken. "The apartment, the landlord tripled the rent. I had to choose. I could pay for the room, or I could send the money home so my sister could finish her exams. So she could have a life." She looked up then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, reflecting the cold LED lights of the garage. "I thought if I was quiet, if I stayed invisible, I could save enough. I didn't think you would ever see me." Menchik looked at the concrete bed, the thin blanket, and the woman who had lived on the edge of his vision while her own world was collapsing. In the underworld, survival was a game of strength and violence. But looking at Zuri, he saw a different kind of survival, a quiet, grueling endurance that required a strength he had long forgotten. The invisible struggle was no longer a theory, it was a reality etched in the lines of her exhausted face, challenging the very order of his fortress. The silence that followed Zuri's confession was not the empty void Menchik was accustomed to, it was heavy, vibrating with the frequency of a life pushed to its absolute limit. He remained standing, his hands relaxed at his sides, yet his presence felt like a physical weight against the backdrop of the gleaming cars. "The money you earn here," Menchik said, his voice cutting through her soft sobs like a scalpel. "It is more than enough for a modest life in this city. Where does it go?" Zuri wiped her face with the back of a trembling hand, the light blue sleeve of her uniform damp with tears. She didn't look at him, but at the oil-stained concrete that had been her bed for the last 3 weeks. "It goes to Accra," she whispered. "My sister, Kofi, she is brilliant, Mr. Menchik. She has the mind of a doctor, but the village has no path for her. Our parents died when the fever took the coast, leaving nothing but debt and a roof that let the rain in." She finally looked up, and for a moment, the hierarchy of master and servant vanished, replaced by the raw transparency of the desperate. "Every one I earn is a brick in her future. It is the medicine for my aunt's lungs. It is the interest on a debt my father signed with blood just to keep us fed. If I spend it on a room for myself, if I spend it on comfort, then back home, the lights go out. The books are closed. The debt collectors come for the only thing we have left, our dignity." She gestured vaguely at the luxury sedan behind her. "You see a car, sir. I see the price of a life. I chose the garage because the concrete doesn't charge rent. The shame of sleeping here is a small price to pay to ensure my sister never has to know what the cold feels like." Menchik watched her, his analytical mind processing the data of her struggle. In his world, debt was a weapon used to enslave, and family was often a liability that rivals used as leverage. But here was a woman using her own body as a shield, absorbing the crushing weight of poverty so that someone else, thousands of miles away, could breathe. He thought of his own ledgers, filled with numbers that represented power and blood. Zuri's ledger was simpler, yet infinitely more demanding. It was a balance sheet of pure sacrifice. The invisible struggle was no longer a shadow in the corner of his eye, it was a mirror, reflecting a type of war he hadn't fought in a long time, the war for mere survival. The cold efficiency of his mansion suddenly felt like an indictment. He was the king of a fortress built on order, yet here, in the very heart of his domain, a human soul was being pulverized by the machinery of his own indifference. Chapter 4. Manshik stared at the woman, but he was no longer seeing the concrete floor of a high-end garage in Gangnam. The antiseptic smell of expensive wax and motor oil began to fade, replaced by the pungent, choking scent of charcoal briquettes and salt water. In the hollow of Zuri's collarbone, in the way her fingers clutched the tattered bag like a life preserver, a memory long buried beneath layers of expensive silk and scar tissue began to claw its way to the surface. He saw a boy. A boy with dirt under his fingernails and ribs that counted themselves against his skin, huddled under a sheet of corrugated metal in a seaside shanty town. He remembered the winter of 1994, when the cold didn't just nip at the skin but bit deep into the bone. He remembered his own mother, her hands cracked and bleeding from scrubbing the floors of people who never looked at her, handing him her only bowl of rice while claiming she had already eaten. He remembered the crushing weight of a debt that wasn't his, a legacy of hunger passed down like a curse. For decades, Manshik had convinced himself that he had killed that boy. He had replaced the hunger with power and the vulnerability with a pistol. He had built this mansion as a monument to the fact that he would never be small or unseen again. But looking at Zuri, he realized that the ghost of that boy hadn't died, he had simply been waiting in the shadows of his own house. Zuri's desperation wasn't a system failure to be corrected, it was a reflection. Her sacrifice for a sister thousands of miles away was the same frantic, holy fire that had once driven a street urchin to become a king. The clinical compassion he usually reserved for strategic alliances felt suddenly inadequate. He looked at his hands, hands that had signed death warrants and crushed rivals, and saw the blood of the lineage they both shared, the lineage of those who survive on nothing but hope and spite. The woman before him was not a maid, and she was not a component. She was a mirror. The mask of the Mafia boss didn't slip, but the eyes behind it changed. The ice didn't melt, it shifted, revealing the dark, turbulent water beneath. He realized that by allowing her to sleep on this floor, he was betraying the only person he had ever truly respected, that starving boy from the slums of Seoul. "Get up," he said. The command was still sharp, but the edge was no longer meant for her. It was directed at the world that had forced her to her knees. "The concrete is for machines, Zuri. You are finished with the cold." The transition from discovery to action happened with the terrifying speed of a landslide. Manshik did not offer Zuri a hand to help her up, instead, he stepped back, reclaiming his distance, but his phone was already out. The clinical glow of the screen illuminated his face, casting deep, angular shadows that made him look like a statue carved from obsidian. He didn't call the household manager or the head of security. He called his lead counsel, a man used to being woken at 3 in the morning to handle international wire transfers and the legal fallout of gang wars. "Wake up," Manshik said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "There is a debt in Accra, Ghana. A family name, a village ledger. Find the creditors. I don't care if they are banks or street corner sharks. Pay them double to disappear. If they hesitate, give them my name." He hung up before the lawyer could stammer a response. His eyes then turned to the household staff who had begun to gather at the edge of the garage, drawn by the unusual light and the sound of Zuri's earlier cry. They stood in a semicircle of terrified silence, their heads bowed. "Listen well," Manshik addressed them, his gaze sweeping over them with the force of a physical blow. "From this moment, the guest wing on the 3rd floor is no longer vacant. It belongs to Zuri. Move her belongings. If I find so much as a speck of dust in those rooms, or if any of you speak a word of this outside these walls, you will find out how deep my basement really goes." The staff scrambled into motion, a frantic blur of activity fueled by the fear of their master. Manshik turned his attention back to Zuri, who was still trembling, her knuckles white as she gripped her tattered bag. "Your debt is settled," he stated, as if he were reading a line from a ledger. "Your sister will finish her exams. Tomorrow, you will provide my office with her school's information. She will have a trust. But you," he paused, his gaze narrowing. "You will no longer sleep in the peripheral vision of this house. You will live where I can see you. Efficiency is no longer your only requirement. From now on, your primary function is to remind this house that I do not allow my own to starve." He turned on his heel, his black shirt snapping as he moved. He left her standing beside the luxury car, no longer a hidden component, but a permanent fixture of his reality. He walked back toward his office, his mind already calculating the next moves, but for the first time in decades, the numbers weren't about profit. They were about the price of a soul's safety. The following morning, the atmosphere within the mansion didn't just change, it recalibrated. The air felt thick, vibrating with a heavy, unspoken tension that shadowed every movement of the staff. In the grand kitchen, the usual morning clatter of copper pots and porcelain was replaced by a strained, rhythmic efficiency. Eyes darted toward the grand staircase, then quickly away, as if looking too long at the upper floors might invite the master's wrath. The hierarchy of the house, once as rigid as the black marble floors, had been shattered in a single night of commands. The staff watched with a mixture of awe and simmering resentment as the head butler, a man who had barely acknowledged Zuri's existence for half a year, carried a tray of silver service breakfast not to the master's study, but to the guest wing. Zuri was no longer a blur in the peripheral vision. She had become a focal point, a living testament to a side of Manchik that none of them had dared to believe existed. When she finally descended the stairs, she wasn't wearing the light blue uniform. She wore a simple, elegant dress provided by the house, her posture tentative, as if she expected the floor to give way beneath her. The other maids, who had once shared cramped quarters and whispered complaints with her, now pulled back as she passed, their silence sharp and edged with a new kind of fear. It wasn't fear of Zuri, but fear of what she represented, the unpredictable mercy of a predator. Manchik sat at the head of the long obsidian dining table, his attention seemingly fixed on the digital stream of global markets on his tablet. He didn't look up as she entered the room, but the tension in his jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of his security detail and his household staff burning into the back of his neck. They were waiting for a slip, a sign that this was a temporary lapse in judgment, a passing whim of a bored king. But Manchik offered no such relief. To him, the tension was a tool. He allowed the silence to stretch, let the discomfort of his subordinates ripen until it was nearly unbearable. He wanted them to feel the weight of the shift. He wanted them to understand that the invisible was now untouchable. Every time a servant hesitated or a guard lingered a second too long in her presence, Manchik's gaze would drift toward them, cold, flat, and predatory. It was a silent warning that the architecture of this house had changed. The fortress was still a fortress, but the gates had been redrawn. As Zuri took a seat at the far end of the table, the sound of her chair scraping against the floor echoed like a tectonic shift. The maid was gone, the protected had arrived. The dining hall was usually a theater of war, a room where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken threats of the underworld. Tonight, the long obsidian table was lined with the architecture of Manchik's power, his top lieutenants. These were men with scarred knuckles and dead eyes, predators who understood the world only through the lens of leverage and dominance. When the heavy doors groaned open, the room fell into a silence so absolute it felt like a drop in cabin pressure. Zuri entered first. She was no longer the trembling figure in the light blue uniform. She was draped in charcoal silk, her head held high despite the visible flutter of the pulse at her throat. Manchik followed, his hand resting not on a weapon, but briefly, almost imperceptibly, on the small of her back as he guided her toward the seat at his right hand. A ripple of confusion, then cold realization, passed through the men. Sang-woo, a man whose loyalty was built on the foundation of Manchik's legendary ruthlessness, cleared his throat. The sound was a challenge. "Boss," Sang-woo said, his voice a gravelly scrape. "The household staff are talking. They say the garage has become a sanctuary. They say the rules that built this family are being softened." He didn't look at Zuri. To him, she was a variable that didn't belong in the equation of their business. He was testing the wind, looking for a weakness in the king he served. Manchik didn't respond immediately. He poured a glass of dark tea, the liquid hitting the porcelain with a rhythmic, steady sound. He finally looked up, his eyes sweeping the table with a predatory stillness that made more than one man shift in his seat. "Order is not maintained by rigidity alone," Sang-woo, Manchik said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "It is maintained by the absolute certainty that what is mine is untouchable. I found a hole in my perimeter. I found a woman who was willing to sleep on concrete to protect her own blood. That is a level of loyalty most of you only pretend to possess." He stood up, leaning over the table, his shadow stretching long and dark over his men. "She is no longer the help. She is a ward of this house. If any of you look at her with anything less than the reverence you show me, if a single word of disrespect crosses your lips, you will find out that my mercy is a limited resource, reserved only for those I choose." He turned to Zuri and nodded once. "Eat." The lieutenants looked at their plates, the defiance in the room collapsing under the weight of his conviction. Menshik had made his choice. He had chosen the ghost of a boy over the logic of the syndicate. At the table of predators, the greatest hunter had just declared a new law. In this fortress, compassion was now a requirement of the crown. As the weeks bled into months, the architectural coldness of the mansion began to thaw. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways, the scent of spices from Zuri's homeland wafting through vents that had previously only carried the sterile smell of air filtration, and the sound of a radio playing softly in the kitchen. The fortress, once a monument to Menshik's isolation, was developing a pulse. Zuri had moved through the house first as a phantom, then as a ward, and finally as something entirely new, its conscience. She did not overstep her bounds, but she no longer lowered her eyes when the guards passed. Instead, she offered them a quiet nod, a human recognition that slowly eroded their stony facades. Even the most hardened among them found it difficult to maintain a mask of pure violence when the woman the boss had deemed untouchable asked after their families or offered them a seat in the kitchen for a hot meal. But the most profound change occurred on the third floor. For years, the door to Menshik's office had been a barrier of solid mahogany and reinforced steel, a clear signal that the king was alone with his ghosts and his ledgers. It was a room where mercy went to die and where the clinical calculator did his darkest work. One rainy Tuesday evening, however, the heavy latch didn't click. The door remained ajar, a sliver of warm yellow light spilling out into the hallway. Menshik sat at his desk, his sleeves rolled up, the light blue glow of his monitors reflecting in his eyes. He heard the soft, familiar tread of Zuri in the hall. In the past, he would have reached for the remote to seal the room. Now, he simply waited. She appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with a single cup of tea, not the bitter, traditional brew his staff usually prepared, but something fragrant and sweet. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She placed the cup on the edge of the black marble desk, her presence a silent bridge between the man he was forced to be and the boy he had tried to bury. He watched her leave, her silhouette framed by the open door. The invisible struggle that had once defined her had been replaced by a quiet grace that now anchored his entire world. Menshik looked at the open doorway, then back at his screens. The numbers of his empire were still there, the profits, the threats, the debts, but they no longer felt like the only things that mattered. The king of the castle realized that the fortress was no longer a cage. For the first time in his life, the silence of the mansion didn't feel like a vacuum waiting for a blade. It felt like peace. The transformation of the mansion was finalized not with a contract or a decree, but with a single word that carried the weight of an ancient vow. It was the anniversary of the night in the garage, a year since the system failure had forced Menshik to look into the mirror of his own past. To mark the occasion, he gathered his inner circle once more, but the setting was different. There were no maps on the table, no weapons in sight, and no dossiers of enemies to be dismantled. Instead, the room was filled with the soft, amber glow of a sunset bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the table was set for a celebration. Zuri sat at the head of the table opposite Menshik, her presence no longer a source of tension, but the very axis around which the house turned. Beside her sat a small, framed photograph of her sister, Kofi, who had just sent word of her medical school acceptance, a miracle funded by the clinical compassion of a man the world feared. Menshik stood, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the dying light. He looked at his lieutenants, then at the staff lining the walls, and finally at Zuri. The coldness that had defined his eyes for decades had not vanished, but it had been repurposed. It was no longer the ice of a void, it was the steel of a shield. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "I told you that order was the only currency of this house. I was wrong." He reached into the pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small, traditional Korean wooden seal, a dojang. He placed it on the table before Zuri. It was carved not with his syndicate's crest, but with a new designation that linked her name to his lineage. "Order is a tool," he continued, his gaze locking with Zuri's. "But safety is the only true currency. And safety is only possible within a family. In our tongue, we call this gajak. It is not merely those who share your blood, it is those for whom you would burn the world to keep warm." He raised his glass, and for the first time, the men at the table didn't just follow an order, they joined a pact. From this day forward, Zuri is not a ward, and she is not a guest. She is Gajak. Her safety is my safety. Her honor is my honor. The word echoed through the hall, settling into the black marble and the smoked glass, changing the very DNA of the fortress. Zuri met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with a quiet, triumphant light. She had walked into this house as an invisible component, a woman sleeping on concrete to survive. Now, she was the heartbeat of an empire. Menshik sat back down, the king of the castle, finally at rest. He realized that while he had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, he had finally succeeded in building a home worth keeping the world away from. The ledger was balanced. The debt was paid. They were no longer ghosts in the dark, they were a family in the light. The tall windows of the mansion no longer reflected a man standing in a void. As Menshik stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawling lights of the city, the glass caught the image of a home in motion behind him. He could hear the distant, melodic sound of Zuri's laughter from the living area and the soft rustle of a life being lived, no longer in the shadows, but with the bold confidence of the protected. For years, Menshik had equated power with the height of the walls he built and the number of lives he could extinguish. He had been a king of ashes, ruling over a sterile domain where every heartbeat was measured by its utility to his bottom line. But the invisible struggle he had witnessed on the garage floor had taught him a lesson that no syndicate war or hostile takeover ever could. An empire without a soul is merely a tomb. He looked down at his hands, once used only to seize and to strike. They were still the hands of a mafia boss, still capable of the ruthless calculations required to keep his territory secure. However, the purpose behind the strength had undergone a radical alchemy. He no longer accumulated wealth for the sake of the hoard, he gathered it to ensure the concrete would never be a bed for anyone under his roof again. He no longer commanded fear to satisfy his ego, but to create a sanctuary where the vulnerable could sleep without checking the locks. The profound purpose he had discovered was not found in the expansion of his borders, but in the depth of his responsibilities. He understood now that the ultimate expression of power was not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to provide a safety so absolute that those within it forgot what it was like to be afraid. As the moon rose, casting a silver glow over the fortress, Menshik turned away from the city and stepped back inside. He closed the balcony doors, but he did not lock them with the frantic paranoia of his past. He walked toward the warmth of the lights, a man who finally understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the empire he had built, but the family he had saved. The king no longer stood alone in his cathedral of marble and glass. He was a protector, a provider, and for the first time in a life of violence, he was a man at peace. The lesson was etched into the very stones of the house: the only power worth having is the power used to lift others out of the dark.